think we'll make a start. We delayed a little bit, thinking there might be a bit of traffic out there, but I think it's time to get underway. So welcome to tonight. Thank you for coming. I see some alums here tonight. I see some longtime supporters of our school. I see current students, and it's just terrific to have you all here tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about leadership, and when I think of our school and what we're about, developing leaders for service in society through business, government, and civil society, I'm thinking about a kind of a cross-cutting issue that goes across all those disciplines. And the kind of leadership we want to encourage here is this one of service to those kinds of groups and those institutions in our society. And it's a kind of a cross-cutting issue because it brings in the role of faith and what we believe about these kind of very important things. And so we're really delighted tonight to have a guest that will help us do that. And I just want to, again, welcome you here. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Uli Chi, who is chairperson of our executive committee for our Center for Integrity in Business. And the Center for Integrity of Business have shaped up a whole day with our guest tonight, who's going to speak to us around what we call a day of calling. And it's about thinking about leadership and vocation in a different way. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Chi to introduce our guest. He is the founder and chair of Human Interaction. He's involved in a leadership center down at the Max Dupree Center in Fuller in Pasadena. And so actually, Uli, you could actually speak on leadership yourself, I think, and do a fine job as well. But anyway, we're going to save that for some other time, perhaps. Yeah. But anyway, I'm going to ask Uli, as a wonderful leader himself, to introduce Chris Lowney. So thanks very much, Uli.
It's very kind, Ross. It's a privilege to introduce Chris. Chris and I met over the last few years in the context of a Catholic health system that Chris is the board chair nationally, and we've served in governance. I serve on one of the regional and local boards, and so we got to know each other a little bit in the context of that work, and I was just really struck by Chris's passion and commitment to live out a particular view of leadership, and I think in many ways, many of the things that SPU holds dear in terms of leadership and how one thinks about servant leadership and is something that Chris has not only written about, he's written several books, including the first book was Heroic Leadership, right, on the Jesuits. And I remember hearing from a friend of mine, Rod Wilson, who was president of Regent College in Canada, good friend. He said that's one of the best leadership books he's ever read. So that's high praise. And I think if you haven't read it, or if you haven't read any of Chris's work, you'll discover that he's a wonderful writer, and he's a terrific communicator of examples and stories about leadership, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. And perhaps most importantly, as I've watched him at work leading a large system like the Catholic Health Initiatives that we are a part of, he lives out what he actually believes. So I think that kind of congruence is a wonderful example to us all. So we're really privileged to have him here, to have him give a talk this morning. It was so good I came back, Chris, to hear it again. So it's really wonderful to have you here with us, and will you help me welcome Chris Lowney?
Okay, that introduction was way too generous, but you know, in life you take what you can get. So thank you, Uli, and thanks Ross, and thanks Jean for the chance to be here. And I know we don't need a microphone with a group like this, but I guess they need it for taping it, so bear with that. So why don't we start right away? And I want to invite us to do a little survey about leadership. A few years ago, a public relations firm asked people if they had a great deal of confidence in the leaders of certain sectors of society. Okay? So I'm going to show you the survey now, and why don't we just have a little show of hands? Let's see how we feel. So if you have a great deal of confidence in our political leaders, why don't you raise your hand? Okay, if you have a great deal of confidence in our... I'm from New York. I take it very personally when you don't raise your hand when we have 2 New Yorkers in the finalist here. How about our business leaders? All right. Oh, look at that. All the business people. Our education leaders. All right. We'll ask Ross to leave. Then we'll have a real vote, and our religious leaders. Okay. Well, I have to tell you, other than politics, you people are way too optimistic. Let me show you what was the correct answer. Here's the result of the survey. And look at that. That was 2007, huh? So we can imagine, I mean, and just think of everything that's gone wrong since 2007. So we can imagine if this survey were done again today, probably all these numbers are going to have to be lower, you know? So there's something in the drinking water here at Seattle Pacific or up here in the Northwest that you feel pretty good, but everybody else in the country feels pretty miserable about what we're dealing with here. And I wonder what might be better. So I want to invite us to do a little thinking quietly. And what if we spend a few seconds and think about the names of 1 or 2 living leaders and the qualities or attributes that you associate with being a good leader. And how about I give a few seconds? Why don't you have a chat with 1 or 2 people nearby, and what names came up? What ideas did you think of? Why don't you just share those, and then we'll hear a couple, and then I'll talk a bit more. I'm interrupting a little bit, I know, but why don't we move? What were some names that started to come up? Why don't we hear 1 or 2 or 3? Pete Carroll, okay. I don't know who you're talking about. All right. Who else? Max Dupree, okay. Jeff Bezos, Amazon country here, and you're about to say? Billy Graham. Okay, fine. And why do we think of these names? So what are some of the qualities or attributes that we all associate with good leadership? What were some of those?
Humility.
Humility. Okay, nice.
Consistent good morals.
Consistent good morals. So maybe those are 2 kind of ideas, you know, good morals and also a kind of a consistency in how you live, I guess, over time and in the different situations you're in. All right, nice.
Inspirational.
To be inspirational.
Her description speaks to integrity.
A sense of integrity, yeah. Okay, so those are nice ideas. Let me talk for a little bit. So who are leaders? Those are good names. I wonder who thought of their own name. Guess nobody, probably next to nobody, or like if you thought of your own name, you probably didn't turn to the group there and say, oh, me, Pete Carroll and me. You gave us humility as a leadership virtue, right? And humility is a really critical virtue in organizations and groups. And we're at a place that sort of that celebrates gospel ideas and gospel values, and there are probably a few things that Jesus spoke of as much as humility. First shall be last, and last shall be first, and those who want the seats at his right and left hand in heaven are told no, in our kingdom it's to serve, huh? So humility is really important, but I want to suggest that when it comes to leadership, the humility is misplaced because we have a broken stereotype about what leadership is. So in other words, when I say think of the names of leaders, our first instinct is to think of Pete Carroll or Jeff Bezos, people who are kind of at the top of a hierarchy and kind of world famous, and that idea of leadership is not the solution to any problems. Here in this university, in this city, in fact, it's part of the problem. And instead, the first people we need to think about as leaders actually are ourselves, and I'll explain why and how that could be in just a couple of minutes. And what do good leaders do to motivate the people around them? That was the other thing we were thinking about. And people came up with really nice ideas, like to be humble and to have some sense of integrity and to have good morals and be consistent in them. I wonder who could have been thinking of anything like this idea articulated by somebody with great credentials. And he said this: you must love those you lead before you could be an effective leader. Now, there's an idea that any of us who care about Christian values could really feel very comfortable with, huh? But in fact, the person who said that is not a pastor or a preacher. The person I just quoted is General Eric Shinseki. Until a few years ago, this guy was highest ranking military officer in the United States, chief of staff of the military. And the first time I heard it, that quote struck me as odd, coming from a military class, that our instinct is we associate with macho, being tough. Or maybe not so odd, because the more I thought about it, the more I suspect that generals actually make better choices if they love the people they must place into difficulty, and I bet that soldiers perform better if they believe they're actually valued by the people who have the terrible job of maybe sending them to face their death. And his quote, in a way, is opening an idea that maybe leadership is less about the fact that I'm a general or what kind of rank somebody hangs on me, and more about how you doing? You're most welcome. And more about the kind of values I'm willing to role model in whatever is my status in life. And when you think about it, I raise the idea that we have to think of ourselves first as leaders, and the first way I would demonstrate that is just referring to the ideas you all gave me when we started to think about qualities of leaders. Most of us were thinking of famous people, but the ideas that were mentioned, every single idea that was mentioned was an idea that every single one of us could role model every day of our lives, huh? People spoke about humility, integrity, strong sense of morals, consistency. Absolutely none of those ideas has anything inherently to do with hierarchy, being famous, running anything. And another way I would demonstrate the idea is if we just looked in a dictionary, we'd see different definitions of the word leadership, of course. But those definitions would always include one like this from Webster: to point out a way, direction, or goal, and to influence others toward it. And isn't it true that everybody here is doing these words all the time, Some people here in this room are parents, and could there be any more obvious example of pointing out a way and influencing others than what parents are doing for their children in the course of a lifetime, And I don't know how big is your team at Amazon, but you're in a team, and everybody there, by virtue of how hard they work, how imaginative they are, how they treat everybody else in the team, they're kind of pointing out a way. This is the way I think we ought to operate as human beings in a group, and having some influence, good or bad. So by the dictionary definition, we all have leadership opportunities. Not if you get to replace Jeff in 30 years, but now, sorry, 20 years, 15 years. You're on a faster trajectory than that, I get it. So, by the dictionary definition, by the ideas you gave me, really everybody has a leadership opportunity and responsibility. In a way, that's the most important idea that I raise, that we might be a little explicit or conscious about the fact that life is giving us always some opportunity and platform to lead. And also, given the environment where we are right now, I also want to talk about how we might understand leadership as somehow a deeply religious and spiritual idea, because a lot of times we tend to think of it as a businessy sort of concept. And I want to talk about it as a religious concept a bit. And the first way I might raise that is to say that for people who are believers, maybe there's a kind of a paradox in the idea of leadership, because I guess if those who are Christian, if we ask them to describe themselves, they would describe themselves as followers, probably. You know, I'm a follower of Jesus, for example. And our religious language uses words that have a following connotation to them. So, for example, we use words like vocation and disciple, and the Latin word voco means I call. So if I call you, you come to me, you're following me. And disciple means learn. If you learn from someone. You're following. But our religious language also uses words like apostle and mission. And those words have exactly the opposite meaning. The roots of those words mean send. And so if I send you, you're not following, you're going, you're out in front there. And so this, I think, is somehow the paradox or dynamic we might understand as religious people of leadership, that somehow following and leading have to go on always at the same time for us. And I think that, you know, the 6th chapter of Isaiah is a nice meditation on how we might understand leadership in this sense. So in that chapter, maybe you'll remember, somehow it's like the prophet's experience of being called, and early in the chapter there's some who will go for us, and he doesn't feel worthy of this call, and he says, woe is me, I'm lost, I'm a man of unclean lips. And then as the chapter goes along, he is touched by God's presence. He's literally touched like an angel. My friend remembers here, brings a charcoal down and touches his lips. And then later in the chapter, the call comes again. Whom shall we send? Who will go for us? And at that point, he's able to say, here I am, send me. And so I think in a way this chapter captures exactly this following and leading dynamic. In other words, that, you know, our being sent, our leadership, somehow comes from outside us. You know, it's nourished from outside us, and it's somehow because we're touched or called that we're able to go. Now, you came here to hear something about Pope Francis, I know. But let me tell you why I started the way I did, because, you know, in a way, the talk is not about Pope Francis. You know, the talk is about us. You know, Pope Francis is like the case study. We're going to think a little bit about his leadership behaviors, his leadership style, but really what I'm inviting is that each of us think about, okay, you know, what about me? You know, there's what that guy does, what do I do? You know, and what's my sense of leadership, and how do I show leadership in my life? So that's why I kind of worked into it the way I did, and now we can begin to talk about Francis. And I'm gonna raise 3 ideas about leadership, 3 qualities of leaders, 3 behaviors. You know, one, that they will win the respect of teams and sacrifice to serve a mission greater than self. And second, they get their feet dirty, they're in touch. And third, that they have a habit of reflection. And, you know, these are not, this is not like the leadership formula, not the most important things about leadership. They're just 3 things that I observed hearing stories about this guy's life before he was the Pope. You know, I wanted to write about him when he was just Bergoglio, because, you know, when the cameras start running, sometimes people put on an act. And so to me, it's somehow more interesting to see, well, who was this guy before the cameras were running? So I had the chance to hear from a lot of people who'd known him 30 years ago, and I asked them to tell me stories, and we're going to talk about 3 of those stories, Doing the Laundry and Dusty Shoes and the Monastery Bell. And in each of those stories, I'm going to try to extract some leadership lesson for us, you know, that might be relevant in our lives as parents or business people or teachers or whatever we're doing. And then maybe also unpack what we might call a spirituality of leadership. You know, how as spiritual or people of faith we might find resources for these ways of behaving in our tradition, okay? And the first thing we're going to talk about is doing the laundry. That's not a picture of the Pope. And here's the story. So he was around 1979, 1980, put in charge of a seminary of the Jesuits in Buenos Aires, you know, a house where young people who were training to be priests would live and study. And at the time he took over, the economy in Argentina was a total basket case, and the seminary was in financial distress. And so he had a meeting. He had a meeting of the seminarians soon after he took over, and he said to them, okay, look, you know, here's the story. We're not in good financial condition. We're no longer going to be able to afford to pay people to come in and clean the hallways and the dishes and so on. We're going to have to do all these things ourselves. And he said, I'll do laundry. That'll be my job. And a couple of them told me that if you had gotten up at 5:30 in those days and walked through the basement of the big institutional building which they lived, you would have seen Bergoglio pitching people's dirty underwear and so on into an industrial washing machine. And you know, the thing that first struck me about this story is that they didn't tell me this story in answer to the question, tell me something that will make me think this guy is nice or holy or something like that. The question I asked them was, tell me something about this guy's leadership as a leader. And I guess for a lot of us, you know, if we said, oh, you know, tell me something about your boss, the leadership of your boss, people would say, oh, you know, he's really good at creating a good strategy for the situation we're in, or she's really good at running a meeting and motivating people. And instead they say, oh, he did the laundry. And they didn't really unpack why they associate that with leadership. But when I heard it, in a way, I almost felt like they were channeling a definition of leadership that the US Air Force uses. They wouldn't have known that, but that's what came to my mind. And I'm going to let you read it, and then I'm going to comment about it a bit. I'll just let you read it first. So the thing I like about this definition is that, you know, I think for a lot of us who have not been in the service, we tend to associate leadership in the service with giving orders. You know, I'm a general, you're a private, I tell you what to do. That's leadership. And the military, of course, above all human institutions, understands that has nothing to do with leadership. You know, your leadership is not the fact that you have a rank, a status. Your leadership is what you're able to do with whatever is your rank, whatever is your status. I mean, look what they say. First of all, that leadership is an art, you know, and it has something to do with influence. And I like this word. It's about winning confidence, respect, and cooperation. And of course, we win people's respect and cooperation and confidence in all kinds of ways, you know. So this guy's my manager, and you know, I come to him with a difficult problem, and he manages to help me figure it out. You know, he's smart, and that really wins my respect. I want to be in his team. Or, you know, we're a sales group, and you know, this guy always manages to help us get business, and so I really have a lot of admiration for his skills. You know, he really wins my respect. I want to be in his team. And in a way, I guess what they were sort of saying is, you know, when that guy did the laundry, I mean, that showed me something, you know, and I wanted to be on the guy's team. Because what's usually the way, I don't know about the Northwest, I'll tell you how the world works in New York. Okay, we're going to have to sacrifice this year. The results are not very good, so we won't be able to pay bonuses. And since I now gave you that difficult news, my bonus is going to go up, you know? And instead, you know, here's Bergoglio saying, look, I'm sorry, we have to sacrifice. And I go first. And that's a very compelling leadership style, you know? And I think also, I suspect they say, oh, you know, the guy is real. I mean, I'm not just a tool here. He actually cares about me too. And, you know, that gets to another idea I want to extract from this doing the laundry story, namely that, you know, I don't imagine that Bergoglio was kind of manipulative in his approach there. You know, he wasn't thinking, oh, you know, if I do the laundry, then they'll all be trapped into having to do what I want them to do. Instead, I think it reflected somehow his notion of how we're supposed to treat other people in life, or especially if we're somehow in authority. And I want to illustrate that a bit by means of this story. A few of you may remember this photo. He was elected Pope just a few weeks before Easter, and we all know the famous story in the Gospels where Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, right? And in many Christian churches, we reenact that story on Holy Thursday. And usually, the way it works for the Pope is the Pope does it in St. John Lateran Basilica, and it's beautiful, and there are nice choirs, and you know the people who have their feet washed are bishops, and they present beautiful feet to the Pope, and so on. And you know Bergoglio, or he was Pope Francis then, instead said, oh, you know, I guess I want to recover the grittiness, the reality of this image. And so he decided to go and do this at a juvenile delinquent center. And he washed the feet of the juvenile delinquents, including a Muslim woman, and that kind of attracted some interest and attention around the world. And then he stood up afterward, here's the point now, and he gave a little sermon, and he said, I'm doing this to remind us that authentic power is service. And, at a school like this, I think most of us would be familiar with an idea like servant leadership. That's not a new idea to any of us. But for many people, it's not the way they would think about leadership. You know, often when we're in charge, the way we think and operate is somehow the opposite. In other words, that the people who work for me are serving me. I don't literally think that way, but in terms of the way I operate, I kind of know, okay, look, I need to get certain things done, and so I need you to do this so I can accomplish it, and I need you to do that. And of course, what he's talking about, and the whole idea of servant leadership would propose, actually we could flip this idea 180 degrees and think about it in completely the opposite way. The people are not serving me, but we're all serving a mission. And my job somehow is to serve the people on my team in order to make sure that all of us are best able to accomplish what we're here to accomplish, So I don't know what that means. In your case, maybe this guy, what he needs is, much better direction from me, and so that's how I'm going to serve him. And, this guy, has a lot of talent, but I need to help him with his skills a bit and training, and so that's how I'm going to serve him. So, from this first idea of doing the laundry, I maybe take away two lessons or challenges from us. The first one is, how in the various ways in which we interact with people in families and communities and jobs, how are we winning people's respect and confidence and cooperation? What's our leadership style? How do we do the laundry? And then secondly, what does leadership mean to me? In other words, for him, the idea is that I'm serving those over whom I have authority. And what does it mean for us? We're behaving as if people are serving me or I'm serving them. Okay, so that's our first idea. And now we're going to talk about two others, Dusty Shoes and the monastery bell or church bell. And you'll see that I put both of these on the same slide because by the time I'm finished, I hope you'll feel that they kind of have something to do with each other. And in a way, they're kind of counterbalancing each other. And, in the Christian tradition, we might understand them this way, that one of them is somehow about incarnational, being immersed in the world, being in touch. The other one is more about, yes, but we understand that there's more to the world than just what's worldly, and we can't be people who are of the world, and we need a spiritual dimension and so on. Okay, so let me tell the story, and we'll see how these two fit together. So the first story about Dusty Shoes, when Bergoglio was running that seminary, at one point he was asked to also take charge of opening up a new church, a parish, in the neighborhood right by the seminary. And it was a very poor neighborhood, no paved roads, basically a shanty town. And he went about it by getting some of the seminarians to volunteer to help him. And he had a meeting with them, and he just assigned each of them to a different part of the neighborhood. And they say, okay, fine, well, what do you want us to do, actually? And he said, just walk the neighborhood. Just visit the people who live there. Pay special attention to people who are poor, see if there's anything we do to help them. And he told them, just keep in mind, you visit a poor person, make sure that you understand that those people are going to be doing something for you. They're going to be teaching you about life. Don't show up like, oh, here I am, and I'm helping you out since your life is such a mess. They're going to help you and teach you before you do anything for them. So they had to go to school Monday to Friday, and then Saturday is when they would do this work. And how would Bergoglio decide who was doing a good job? He would just hang out near the entrance to the seminary at the end of the day and just watch as people started straggling home and who has dusty shoes. Those are the ones who are doing the job. Okay, so this is a cute little story. How could we extract any leadership lessons from it? And I guess here's how I want to go about that. I think that modern life, for many of us, tends to disintermediate us, cut us off from the realities we're supposed to be engaged with. In other words, a lot of times I'm a manager, but the only way I perceive the world is really through spreadsheets, emails, reports from a handful of people who are most in touch with me, and I'm kind of not really in touch with the lives of the people I'm supposed to be managing or the real problems I'm supposed to be managing. There was a guy who worked with me at Morgan, and whenever he was assigned to a new department, the first thing he would do for the first couple of weeks is just go from desk to desk and sit next to each person for an hour or so. And of course they were mortified, because why does your boss spend any time with you except to gather information that he's then going to use to fire you? And over time though, they kind of understood what he was about. His mentality was, well, you've been here 10 years, I'm new. So how in the world am I going to understand what's really going on in this business unless I see how you work, and what you do and what goes on? I'll tell you another story about being in touch, getting shoes dusty. So there was an emergency room patient. I heard a doctor tell this story, not in our hospital system, but in another. And what emergency room doctors uncharitably call a frequent flyer. A woman was there like every month. And extremely frustrating for the medical staff because the condition, let's say she had diabetes, very controllable condition, and all she needed to do was just follow the instructions and take the meds that the doctors gave her. And so there she is month after month. And it turns out that a social worker happened to be visiting her at home one day around noon or whenever this time she was supposed to take some of her pills. And the social worker sees the woman fishing around in the junk drawer, where we keep all our stuff, and then she takes out a bottle and she starts doing one of these things. So what was the real issue? She needed glasses. She couldn't read these tiny labels that we print on these bottles. So in a way, I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars the hospital system spent on trying to treat this person, but because the system wasn't really in touch enough, because our shoes were not dusty enough, we never understood what was the reality of her situation. Now, I want to tell one more dusty shoe kind of story, which will be the bridge into talking about the church bell, and it's also a story about Bergoglio. Bergoglio at a certain point became bishop in Buenos Aires, and one afternoon while he was bishop, he was supposed to go out into the suburbs of Buenos Aires to say Mass in a convent for nuns. And before he left, he went into the cathedral to say a few prayers. And so now he has to go catch his train. He gets up, he's walking out, and some young man stops him as he's walking and wants to speak to him, basically go to confession in the Catholic Church to get counseling. And Bergoglio, the guy seems like either on drugs or a little disturbed, and Bergoglio has to run to catch a train, and he says, look, I'm sorry. I have to run for a train. I can't hear your confession, but just wait here. In 20 minutes, another priest is going to come, and I'm sure that priest will help you. So Bergoglio goes off, and he says that he went a block, and then he stopped. And he felt ashamed of himself, and he comes back into the cathedral. He finds the guy, and he says, okay, I'm going to hear your confession. And in fact, the guy was kind of troubled, and so he spends more time chatting with him afterward. And then I guess he arrives late where he's supposed to be going, but you're the bishop, you get away with that in the Catholic Church. And afterward, he wrote that he felt ashamed of himself because he realized that, in a way, his sense of his own importance, and I have this important schedule, and I have all these things to do, he had managed to allow that to totally drown out or overwhelm his sense of, gee, why am I a priest in the first place? Why am I a human being in the first place, if not to help those who are needy? Now, I hope you hear this kind of a story with at least a bit of ambivalence. On the one hand, I hope you feel, okay, I'm happy that the guy who's Pope is somebody who thinks that way, who acts that way. But on the other hand, I hope there's at least a tiny bit of you that says, okay, well, Chris, that's a nice story. But let me tell you something. If I stopped and gave 100% attention every time I ran across a situation of need or a problem, this university or my business or whatever it is would ground to a halt in about a week. And the reality is that actually sometimes it's more important or essential to prepare the lecture I'm going to give to 50 people rather than keep talking to you for another 3 or 4 minutes about what's bothering you right now, And we all have to make these kind of judgments, about what should I be doing right now. And that, I think, is where the church bell or the monastery bell becomes very helpful. And let me tell you the story about that. So when Bergoglio started running that seminary, he introduced a regime where he would have a bell rung at different times during the day to remind all the seminarians to do something. So I ring the bell, everybody come for lunch, I ring the bell, now it's time for us to go to church and pray together. And he also used to have the bell rung to remind all the seminarians to do a process that is quite common in the Christian tradition. In the way Jesuits do it, they call it their examen. In other words, to examine yourself. And I'm going to teach you a very simplified idea of how one might do it. What their practice is every day they're supposed to take 2 little mental stops. So let's imagine once after lunch and once at the end of the workday. And I'm going to take 5 minutes, and I'm going to do 3 simple things. One is that I'm going to remind myself, why am I grateful as a human being? We tend to spend our whole lives about problems and to-do lists, and just for a moment, I'm going to forget all that, and why am I grateful? And then secondly, I'm going to lift my horizon a little bit. And when I say lift my horizon, I mean this, that we tend to live life about 6 inches off the ground, I have to return this call, and this guy cut me off at the intersection, and I'm really pissed off, and this is what I want to have for lunch, and so on. And instead of thinking about that, let me lift my horizon to like 60,000 feet and remind myself, gee, why am I here on earth anyway? Or what do I believe? Or why did I decide to come and work in this university or study in this university? And then third, I'm going to mentally go back through the last few hours and relive the situations I was in, the meetings I was in, the problems I was grappling in, and try to take away some little lesson, So maybe I was irritated all morning and I kind of lashed out at this guy who works for me. But he had nothing to do with it. It was my issue. So now let me process that and get on with it. Or as a believer, what I might do is let me go back through the last few hours and the situations I was in and try to perceive how is God present to me or trying to be present to me and the people I met and the problems I had to deal with. And I think the genius of this really simple process becomes obvious when we think about the lives we're all trying to lead. We're kind of floating along here on this river of email and text, meeting, distraction, and we're kind of totally plugged into every conceivable external stimulus and distraction, but we're totally out of touch with the only things that ultimately matter. What's really going on inside me, and in what way is God acting in my life now? And I hope you can kind of appreciate how these two somehow have something to do with each other, that on the one hand I'm saying, in order to lead well, we need to be really in touch, we need to be immersed, we have to have our feet dirty. Or to think of it in a Christian sense, we're incarnational people, we believe that the world is a good place and it means something that Jesus came to live in this real world. But on the other hand, we also have to be able to step back from the chaos and take stock in order to be good leaders. Or as Christians, we have to have some habit that acknowledges that we're spiritual people, and part of why we're here is to be in communion with God. So I have one or two more ideas just to finish, but let me suggest that I stop here now for a minute, and we could have any Q&A or discussion. But before I do that, how about if I invite just 30 seconds or a minute of conversation among yourselves, and how about if people think, what was one idea that struck you? One idea that you liked, one idea that you really disagreed with, one idea that you find relevant to your own life or your organization. So why don't you just have that kind of discussion and share that? We'll hear a couple of those, and any questions or comments. Is that okay? All right, great. Okay, friends. So why don't we have a few minutes of open forum, and somebody might want to share what you were just talking about now, what struck you, or if anybody has any other comment or question they want to ask about anything I said or about my own background or things I didn't say, all is welcome. Please.
So we were just conversing about what you were talking about, leadership in the workplace, the working environment, and I was just thinking, do you think it's like a common issue that people mix up like management with leadership, like such as management focusing more on just like achieving their goals and leadership like influencing people more?
Yeah. Okay. So at one point this was a really big theme in both in business but also in studies, kind of distinguishing difference between managers and leaders, and the idea of leadership, we tended to associate with helping us to get through change, having some sense of where we need to go in the future, and managerial skills on the other hand we tended to associate much more with keeping the trains running and these kind of things. And I think there's some value to that. I think it also in my own work life, it also could have a kind of a downside to it, that we tended to we got into sort of labeling people. Oh, this guy's just a manager, or this guy's a real leader, this kind of stuff, Whereas I think, in fact, we sort of need both from people, So I find it a helpful idea, the nuanced difference between what does it mean to manage, what does it mean to lead. It could be a helpful idea for us, but also one that sometimes people can misuse in a way that's not really productive in the workplace also. Yeah. How does it come up in your own work life? Yeah, how does it come out, like, in the, what do you, how do people use the idea, or what puts it in your mind to mention it?
It was just like a discussion that we had in one of my classes, and I found it very interesting. It like seemed like you touched on that topic, so I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah. Okay. Please.
We were chatting a bit about how difficult it is to find any time to do reflection. And it's funny, obviously, I'm sure your time at you is very intense and fast-paced. How did that work for you? How did you instill a discipline in your own life to take?
Yeah. So, you could hear okay, the question? So I had good times and bad times. I mean, as you know, I was away from New York, from the U.S. for a while, and for a while I had a pretty good habit in Tokyo of going for. There was a park not far from Morgan's office. I used to go for a walk after lunch. In London, there was a little church quite close to Morgan's office that I used to go, and similarly in New York, there happened to be a church right next to. Not that you have to go anywhere, I mean, maybe the easiest place to do something like this is right at your desk. But at least in my life, I used to find it's easier for me to do it if physically I go away from the place that has too many reminders of work, But the pitfall, as came up this morning in the conversation, the pitfall is always that I get too busy. And then I feel like I'm too busy to do it. So it sort of slips my mind, or I push it away. But in fact, when you're too busy is exactly the time when you most need to do it, I mean, I know folks who do the obvious kind of things. I set my phone alarm. I don't do it, but I know people who do. I'm going to set my phone alarm for 12:30 or something, and that will help remind me to do it. Once I gave a talk to a guy who managed a department of people were there among the audience, and he says, this is a great idea, and he says to his group, from now on, between 12 and 12:05, this is what we're going to do. No, we won't call each other, we won't have meetings or anything like that. And I remember thinking, oh man, I mean, that's great. I mean, I'm not sure that the clients are going to stop calling between 12 and 12:05, but it's great that you do something.
Well, you have to have focus. And everybody in your company has to be knowledgeable of that focus. And you cannot be better than anybody else to achieve that goal. And so you can't be afraid to step into their shoes once in a while and find out what they're doing and actually do their job for them. If that doesn't hurt you.
Yeah.
That's nothing that I've known through my career.
So you had your own way, your own philosophy of getting your shoes dusty. Sounds like, yeah.
So that's definitely. Yeah. Sometimes people thought I was kind of dumb to do that because they didn't have to.
Yeah.
But it's good to do because they know what they're doing. But then they have to be part of the goal.
Yeah.
They have to see that their work is as important as your work.
Yeah, great. What did you do? Could I ask? What do you do?
I ran a milk company.
Okay, great.
And I did it for about 35 years. But when I was young, it was a lot more difficult than when I got older. Because I couldn't see those. But you have to not be afraid to be just what the other guys doing and have him be part of your team.
Yeah.
If they're not, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay, good for you. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? So let me share one last idea, and then we'll be done. I'll let you have a look at it, and then I'll comment on it. Once I had the privilege to visit Quantico, some of you know is the Marine base where, among other things, the elite officer corps is selected, and everybody's seen on television or in movies depictions of what they put these candidates through. They're like waking them up in the middle of the night and hosing them down with water and sending them off, marching with heavy packs and no compasses and all the rest of it. And at one point, I asked the colonel, the guy who was overseeing this part of Quantico, I said, okay, well, I totally get the fact that part of what you're doing here is you're trying to assess who's tough enough and resilient enough to survive in this corps. But beyond that, what skills you're trying to give these people by all this nonsense? I didn't say it that way, but that's what I was thinking. And he didn't stop to think. He'd obviously thought about it. And he said, you know what I'm doing here? The only thing I'm doing here, I'm trying to get these people comfortable with the reality of being uncomfortable. And, he meant it literally, of course. He's going to be putting people in battle zones, and that's a very uncomfortable environment, I'm sure. I mean, I've never had people shooting bullets at me, but I'm sure when it happens, it's not comfortable, and all of your human instincts are bad. I run away, I get paralyzed, I can't make a decision. And I guess what he felt he was trying to do is help them to practice what it feels like to be uncomfortable and to try to convey to them somehow it's okay to be uncomfortable. But we just need you to understand that you know how to operate and think and work and to keep operating in very uncomfortable environments. And the reason why I like this story and tell the story is as soon as he said, I'm just trying to get these people comfortable with being uncomfortable, I felt, okay, now I have my metaphor for the 21st century, because I haven't met anybody in any industry who doesn't feel this way. We just live in a very uncomfortable situation right now in many ways. Like we have to make decisions and we don't have enough information, or we have to make decisions and we can't see the future clearly enough, or we work out a strategy or a plan, but then within 3 months, everything has changed, we have to start over, and on and on and on, And when you manage people or work with people, sometimes it seems like, there are folks who, the way they operate is there's just too much, and I can't cope, and I'm gonna kind of put on my helmet and just sink into the trench, and then when everything calms back down again, then I'll stick my head out and I'll make a contribution. And you kind of want to say to them, hey pal, I hope the 22nd century will be like that, but it doesn't look like the 21st will, And so, we all somehow need to get comfortable with the reality of, okay, I'm sorry, this is just the way it's going to be like, and I don't like it, and I wish it was different, but this is the way it's going to be. And in a way, I feel like our spiritual traditions, and I shared some of its technology, some of its know-how, some of its wisdom with us, is giving us ways that's going to help us cope and manage with the very uncomfortable situations in which we find ourselves in the world these days. So I know everybody is busy and it's the end of a long day for many people, and I just want to thank folks for coming out, some of you for a second time, and spending some time to listen and to share. So thanks very much.
Chris, thank you very much for coming today. Thank you. It's been a great day for us here in the School of Business, Government, and Economics. They have such a wonderful leader share with us his philosophy, leadership, rooted in the faith, and it's been tremendous to reflect on what it means to be a leader. So many, many thanks. Thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight. Really appreciate it.